Hello and welcome to Vertebrate Paleontology. This is a sample lecture of my Vertebrate Paleontology class taught at Utah State University in the Uintah Basin. And this is Geology 6350. And in this lecture we're going to be talking about one of my favorite groups, a bizarre group, a group that doesn't get enough attention, and that is the Archosauromorphs, which are a group of interesting reptiles that are ancestral to crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds. Now, one of the interesting things that happened after the Permian-Triassic extinction event was that there was a whole new group of animals that were sort of the survivors of that mass extinction event. And so it was a time of diversification during the early Triassic. And one of the groups that really did quite well during the early Triassic, after the Permian-Triassic mass extinction event, was a group called the Archosauria, which is the group we're going to be talking about today. Now you'll note in this diagram here, you can see that there's a number of different groups that actually survived, including the group that eventually led to mammals, a group that led to Testatutes, the turtles, and then the Archosauria that's going to lead to dinosaurs and birds, and then the Leptosauria that led to modern lizards and snakes. So we'll talk about the basal group of Archosauromorphs that were around during the late Permian and particularly abundant during the Triassic period. So the Archosaur group is sort of placed in a number of different families, and as we talk about these, we'll talk about each one of these. But there's two major groupings that we're going to discuss in detail, and that's the Curotarsi and the Avimetatarsali. Kind of a mouthful. The Curotarsi are the group that includes the crocodilians that are living with today, the crocodile and alligator, as well as a number of interesting sort of groups that are crocodile-like. Some of them are more dinosaur-like than crocodiles. And then another group, they're the Avimetatarsales. This includes the pterosaurs as well as the dinosaurs and birds. So those are two big monophyletic groupings within the Archosauromorphs. And then there's a group of archosaurs that are more primitive than either of those two groups. And these are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. So our first learning objective for this lecture is I want you to be able to list the key features of basal Archosauromorphs and be able to identify them on a skeleton. So let's look at these. The first one is something called the antorbital fenestra. An antorbital fenestra is found in all of these groups of Archosauromorphs. And it is an opening that's located in front of the orbit where the eye is. And this is the antorbital fenestra. So this is an opening that's just in front of the eye. And these are diapsid reptiles, so they have the two openings behind the orbit. And now they have a new opening between the eye and the nasal opening that opens up for the nostril. They also have another opening that's located in the lower jaw, and this is called the mandibular fenestra. Fenestra means window. So the mandibular fenestra is located down here on the lower jaw on both sides, and there's a little opening that we're going to see. And that's found in all Archosauromorphs. They also have what's called thecodont teeth. Thecodont means that the teeth are actually set in sockets. So think of a crocodile or an alligator skull you might have seen. The teeth are embedded around bone, so the bone is kind of situated in there. So it's a socket that tooth fits into. If you look at many lizard teeth, the teeth are on the sides or kind of in a sort of furrow within the jaw. They aren't necessarily in sockets like a crocodile will. And that's a characteristic of Archosauromorphs. In fact, this group used to be called thecodonts because of this characteristic. They also have a modified ankle joint. This enhances the rotation between the astragalus and calcaneum. We'll talk in more detail about the different ways in which the Archosauromorphs have modified their ankle joints in a moment. The other thing that sort of unites them as a group is pneumaticity in the vertebral column, or in the various individual vertebrae. We'll talk about what this means, but it's basically where air sacs in the breathing apparatus of these organisms invaginated within the skeleton and left a mark, so we can locate these openings for these air sacs in the vertebral column. And I'll talk a little bit more about which groups had pneumaticity in the vertebra of these archosauromorphs. They had an enhanced hearing capability and impedance matching middle ear, which is the air-filled space of the ear, and that is where the stapes bone sits, in which provides the space between the eardrum and the inner ear, the fluid-filled part of the ear. And then there's also a fourth trochanter on the femur that's found in this group. A trochanter is basically a projection that comes off the femur, and this is for an additional attachments of muscles that actually allowed this group of organisms to have a much more upright stance, and that trochanter that sits there allowed them to basically abduct or bring in the femur as they walked, and so they tend to have a much more upright stance that we'll see in many of these groups. So all of these traits are the traits that I want you to be able to identify on a skeleton or even a picture of a skeleton. All right, so let's look at learning objective number 2. I want you to be able to identify the presence of skeletal pneumaticity in various archosauromorphs. And this is a little bit tricky, but we're going to take a look at this particular feature of pneumaticity so we can kind of look at the various fossil archosauromorphs and see where pneumaticity comes into play. Now, this is kind of controversial of which group actually has pneumaticity, but there's a paper by Groller in 2001 that indicated that this very primitive archosauromorph called Rauisuchian had possible pneumaticity, that is, little openings along the vertebral column that were invaginated in life by a air-filled air sac. And you can see that labeled P in this diagram below here. Along the vertebral column are these little pouches here. Rauisuchian is known from the lower Triassic, and so this is indeed a very early representation of something that we'll see later on, particularly in dinosaurs and birds, which are members of the archosauromorphs. So this is some pictures of how extreme some of these archosaurs go in terms of the cavity space along the vertebral column to house air sacs that pass through these. These are cervical vertebrae that we see in sauropod dinosaurs that have lots of openings for these air sacs, and so they're very complicated structures, anatomical structures, and probably were invaginated by these air sacs. Now, modern birds, I mentioned, have these air sacs. So this is a duck in which the air sacs have been filled up with blue latex. And we can see that the air sacs, unlike mammals like we, which have just a simple lung system, birds have this amazing intricate network of air-filled sacs in which they can breathe into, and those air sacs can push the air into their lungs. And so this allows for a continuous flow of oxygenated air into the lungs and helps them become extremely efficient, especially at things like flying. It also does an important role in terms of lightening up the skeleton. It enhances the bird's ability to fly. And you can see with this duck that not only is the vertebral column invaginated by this air sac system, but even the air sac goes into the humerus, which is pretty incredible to think about. So the respiratory system of birds is very specialized. So we have all of these wonderful air sacs that birds breathe into, and then these air sacs basically push back that air into the lung system. And so there's kind of a continuous flow of air in the lungs of birds. And so this is a great little textbook diagram of the respiratory system that you see in birds in terms of the ability to continually have oxygenated air flowing into the lungs, which makes them very efficient at flying. And we can try to go back and look at many of these skeletal features to try to figure out where we see pneumatic features, invaginations in the bone. So we're dealing with bone. A lot of times we're looking at, particularly along the cervical vertebrae, looking for pockets that we might find along there. So in this lower diagram of a vertebrae, we see that there's some kind of pockets in here for air sacs. And if we open up these and cut them open, we can actually see that there is all this opening space inside the vertebral column that basically also serves to lighten up the skeleton as well. Now, Erythrosuchus was one of the possible most primitive groups of archosaurs that had pneumaticity in its vertebral column. But this is something we see much more when we get into dinosaurs and when we get into birds. But there are a few of these archosauromorphs that have this pneumaticity. All right, let's take a look at learning objective number 3. I want you to be able to distinguish between a crocodile normal and reverse conditions and the articulations between the astragalus and the calcaneum and the separation of the two groups that I mentioned before, the Curatarsiae and the Avimetatarsiae. So let's look at what this means. This is basically the two major groups of archosauromorphs. So the Curatarsiae is the group that includes living crocodiles and alligators, gavids, caimans, and as well as a whole host of really incredible extinct organisms. The Avimetatarsiae includes the pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds. So let's take a look at the character that separates these two major groups of archosauromorphs. So the Curatarsiae have a condition which we refer to as crocodile normal. So this is the arrangement of bones in the ankle that we see in crocodiles as well as all members of the Curatarsiae. What you'll notice is that there is an interesting peg and socket articulation between the calcaneum and the astragalus. So the astragalus has a little peg that sticks out and articulates with like a little opening or socket in the calcaneum. So it has a peg in there, so it allows rotation along the astragalus and calcaneum. There's also a calcaneal tubercle replaces the fifth metatarsal as the primary lever for ventral flexion. And we see a proximal wheel-like facet against the calcaneum, which then rotates with the fibula. So this basically means that these crocodile normal joints had a rotation where they could kind of kick their back feet out along that rotation. And we see this with living alligators and crocodiles. So the Curatarsius is this monophyletic group, and it includes a whole diversity of interesting members. And they're all recognized by the fact that they have this sort of peg and socket astragalus and calcaneum in the ankle. And here's some pictures of what some of these bones actually look like in some of the Curatarsians. So they have the astragalus has kind of a peg, the calcaneum has an opening there, and they also have this attachment to on the side for ventral flexion. Now let's take a look at the other group, the Avimetatarsiae, and see what feature they have. They have what we refer to as the crocodile reverse. Now the crocodile reverse is very different ankle configuration than we saw in the crocodile normal. In the crocodile reverse, the articulation, the joint between the calcaneum and the astragalus, does not rotate, doesn't move. In fact, they are pretty solid. The other important feature about the crocodile reverse configuration that characterize the Avimetatarsiae is that the weight actually falls on the three middle digits, number 2, number 3, number 4. And this is going to give us those 3 digits that are going to be coming down in the hind foot they're going to be very characteristic of both birds and dinosaurs later on. So that's where the weight is, and then they rotate along that. All right, so this is a big monophyletic group, and here is a good illustration. If you go to any natural history museum and take a look at the feet, the back feet of dinosaurs, you'll see this configuration of the crocodile reverse, where the astragalus and the calcaneum are very solid. In fact, oftentimes the astragalus is completely fused with the tibia, the distal end of the tibia, in dinosaurs and in many birds. And so it's a single joint, and then you see sort of 3 major toes that are coming down. And you'll see this in various states as you compare the various dinosaurs. But something that is found in both dinosaurs and pterosaurs and includes this big group of Archosauromorphs. All right, so let's test you. Let's see if you can figure out what this one is. So take a moment, think about it. Is it crocodile reverse, or is it crocodile normal? All right, think you know? All right, this is a crocodile normal joint, and you can see that the fact that the major portion of where it rotates between the astragalus and the calcaneum cuts across there. You can also see this big tuber, the big projection on the back of the calcaneum that would be for attachments of the ankle, or the ankle muscles, like the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles on the back there. And that's where the rotation is going to be between the calcaneum and astragalus. So this is a Curatarsian crocodile normal joint. All right, let's look at learning objective number 4. I want you to be able to interpret the major patterns of archosauromorph evolution and explain the level of diversity found in various fossil groups. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the various groups of archosauromorphs. All right, before we go through and talk about all these different groups, and you get lost with all these names, I want you to kind of picture a set of Russian dolls. And so as we move through and talk about the various groups, we're moving closer and closer to the more advanced groups. So the basal groups are placed in a group called the Archosauromorpha, which includes all the subsequent members we're going to talk about. There's 3 families that we're going to talk that are in this outer group, or this outer Russian doll. That is Trilophosauridae, the Rauisuchian, and the Prolassiformes are also known as the Protorosaura. So we'll take a look at those 3 groups. Those are in the outer Russian doll. The next, the middle Russian doll, is a group called the Archosauromorphs. And these include 4 different families: the Proterosuchidae, the Erythrosuchidae, the Euparkerii, and the Protochampsidae. So we'll look at those 4 groups that are in the middle Russian doll. In the very center of a Russian doll set are the advanced group, which is the Archosauria proper. These will include a few problematic forms of thecodonts, as well as our 2 monophyletic groups that we've talked about, the Curatarsiae, that includes crocodiles, as well as Phytosaurs, which we'll talk about, and the Avimetatarsalia, which includes the pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds. So let's take a look at each of these groups. So first, let's start with the outer Russian doll, the basal Archosauromorphs. So the first family that we're going to look at is a group called the Trilophosauridae. The Trilophosauridae is known from the Triassic of Texas, where some amazing specimens have been found, as well as Nova Scotia. These are bizarre creatures. They are diapsid reptiles. Some of them have an anorbital fenestra and others don't. They all tend to have a beak in the front, so they have kind of a parrot or bird-like shape to their skulls. They are presumed to be arboreal, and this is based on the fact that they have these very long fingers or digits with really sharp claws. And they're often found in association with sort of forested areas in the past. They are herbivores. None of them appear to be specialized in carnivore diet, so they're herbivores, and they actually have a sort of a specialized adductor muscle that allowed them to be pretty efficient chewers of vegetation. One of the other interesting features is that they have lost their lower temporal opening. So we call that condition the euryapsid condition, and you might remember that from a previous lecture. So these are euryapsid in terms of the fact that the lower opening, post-orbital opening, has been lost, and so we have a euryapsid condition. The next group is the Rhynchosauridae. The Rhynchosauridae is a really fascinating and interesting group that was very abundant during the Triassic period. They're known from every continent except for Australia and Antarctica. They had an interesting beak-like premaxilla, In fact, the two, in many of these groups, the two beaks kind of pass each other, and they had kind of this weird parrot-like head. They had a single nose opening, a medial external nares that was one opening in the nose. They also had multiple rows of teeth that kind of set in basically a battery of teeth on the upper part of the maxilla extending down. And you can see that in this figure here, these wonderful rows of teeth in the upper part of the mouth. They are believed to be fairly fast locomotion, able to run around and scurry around on four legs. And many of them were probably good diggers, digging around with their hind foot and using their features of their hind foot to really dig down and get into things. So these are Rhynchosauridae, a very common group in the Triassic. The next group we're going to talk about is probably the most unusual group of Archosauromorphs, and that is the Prolassiformes, or Protorosauridae. This is a group of about 16 genera. They're all fairly small and lizard-like in their appearance, but they're all characterized by a number of interesting features. One of them is that they have really long necks with multiple numbers of vertebrae that are longer than we see in other groups of archosaurs. They share many traits with pterosaurs, and it is believed that these guys might be closely related to the origin of pterosaurs. Both are archosauromorphs, and so they're kind of positioned together. Right now, pterosaurs seem to be a little bit more closely related to dinosaurs, but this is one of those really bizarre groups that may be close to pterosaurs. They're known from the Upper Permian, perhaps, but they're fairly common in the Upper Triassic, especially in Europe, and the best specimens come from Italy, but they're also known from Australia, North Africa, and recently North America. So let's look at a couple of these really fascinating Prolassiformes. One of the really weird ones is Macronemius, which is a little Prolassiformes that's known from the Triassic of Italy. It has a very long, elegant neck. Kind of looks like a lizard, but with long legs, much longer than you see in a typical lizard, so probably able to walk and move around fairly quickly and scurry around. One of the interesting things about Macronemius is it has skin that's preserved with scales on the tail. So they had a very scaly tail. So interesting little reptile that's known from the Triassic. Probably the bizarrest of the Prolassiformes is the Drepanosaurs. This is Drepanosaurus, which is a genus known from Italy. Really bizarre, probably the most bizarre creature that maybe ever existed. It's got this weird hook-like tail at the end of the tail, which is just bizarre, like this really weird hook. It's got these really massive, huge claws. In fact, look at that claw on the hands. I mean, huge claws. I mean, how would you even grip something with a claw that was that wide? And they had these kind of like barrel-shaped bodies and very stiff kind of skeletons. It's a very bizarre group, the Drepanosaurs, known from the Triassic, maybe into a little bit of the early Jurassic as well. They're believed to be arboreal, so they'd use that hook to kind of hang off of branches or in the tree and kind of move between branches, gripping with those interesting and intricate little claws. This is Meglancosaurus, and it's another Prolassiformes closely related to Drepanosaurus. And this one we have a skull for, and it has this weird beak-like skull. So they have this beak-like skull. Again, they share lots of traits with pterosaurs, and then they have these weird specialized hands. One of the things about their hands that's really fascinating is that they've turned some of the digits around so they could grab branches, and they may have been kind of chameleon-like in the way that they crawled around. The other thing that they tend to have with these barrel-shaped, very stiff skeletons is that they might have been able to rear back very slowly, and then when they saw a bug that walked by, they could lunge at the bug and bite it and eat it like modern-day chameleons. So very interesting, very fascinating group. Known from a handful of skeletons, mostly known from Italy, but we're getting some skeletons of these in North America and in Australia. So very, very interesting group. And hopefully we can find more skeletons and really understand this group better. one of the most really bizarre and weird prolasiformes is the Tannostrophus, which is this like super elongated, really long necked archosauromorph. And it's just really bizarre. It's got this really interesting head, probably was able to eat fish. The neck length could get up to 7 feet long, really long necks. And there's been a lot of debate of why these little animals were doing with these really long necks. One of the ideas that's been put forth is that they were using their long necks to kind of like fish for food, so they could reach out and be right above the lake and then take that long neck and go bloop, 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 and bite little fish and eat them up. Be yummy fish. But anyway, other people have suggested that they were using these long necks basically to swim and were semi-aquatic and were swimming around a little bit like we see later on with plesiosaurs, the Loch Ness sort of group of reptiles that we'll talk about later on. So very long necks that were stretched out up to 7 feet long, much longer than their entire body. So very bizarre group, these prolasiformes. All right, so now let's talk about the middle archosauriforms. These are sort of the middle Russian doll that we'll talk about. They're positioned kind of a little bit closer to our two crown groups. One of the ones we'll talk about is Proterosuchus, and this one is kind of getting more to a creature that looks more like a dinosaur. These are known from the Karun Basin of South Africa and are Triassic in age. This is Chasmodosaurus, which we know from a really nice skull. You'll note that if you look at this drawing of a skull, you'll note that it's missing something. If you stare at it a while, you'll realize that they incorrectly drew it, and they forgot the mandibular fenestra on the lower jaw. Forgot to put that opening in there. And you can see that on the actual picture of the specimen here. They kind of look a little bit like crocodiles. You'll see that they have an interesting hook to their premaxilla on their their beak there. These guys also have a fourth trochanter on the femur. That's one of those characteristics of Archosauromorphs, is that fourth trochanter. So a little bit more upright stance on many of these guys. The next group is the Erythrosuchidae, and we talked a little bit about this because it's the first group, or the most primitive group, that seems to have the pneumaticity on the vertebral, at least according to Gowler 2001. This family includes 9 genera. They're known from the Karun Basin of South Africa in the lower Triassic, but they've also been found in Europe, Asia, North and South America, so they got around. These were big reptiles, about 5 meters long, and in many ways they kind of resembled crocodiles. They've lost their central bone, which is an important bone in the wrist, and they appear to be semi-aquatic, so inhabiting a sort of habitat that was similar to crocodiles do today. They are believed to be very closely related to the next group we're going to be talking about, and that's the Euparkeridae. So the Euparkeridae is sort of the textbook example of a primitive archosaur. They're known from the lower Triassic of the Karun Basin in South Africa, but there's been some really amazing specimens that have been found in Poland recently. They're sort of the typical basal archosaur. They have socketed teeth, and what's interesting about their teeth is that they're serrated, which meant that these guys were carnivores. So they're carnivorous. They kind of resemble dinosaurs in many ways, and they got to be fair size. They were sort of middle to small group of reptiles here. The other feature that they have that you see in many other groups is osteoderms. Osteoderms are basically bony scutes that are underneath the skin, and these basically are found in crocodiles and alligators today, for example, and in many dinosaurs. So these guys had osteoderms, so another derived characteristic, advanced character. They also possibly were bipedal. Oftentimes they're reconstructed as being either quadrupedal or bipedal, and they had a much more upright stance with that fourth trochanter in the femur. They kept their femurs below their body and were able to run around more upright and more quickly around the landscape. The next group is very poorly known. We only got a few bones of this group, and that's why I don't have any pictures of them, but they kind of resemble crocodiles. This is the Proterochampsidae. There's 6 genera, They're all Triassic. They're poorly known from South America. So this is a South American group. They have a small temporal opening, and they have reduced their fifth digit. They also have a very primitive pelvis. They're positioned close to Phytosaurs and crocodiles, and I think once we get some better specimens, we might know a little bit more about this particular family from South America. All right, so now let's talk about the advanced groups. Now let's talk about that inside Russian doll, the smallest Russian doll, and these are the most specialized group of archosaurs, the Archosauria. Now, Archosauria sensu stricto basically means that all of the descendants of the common ancestor of both birds and crocodilians. So this includes these two groups that we talked about, the Curatarsi and the Metatarsiale. There is one interesting fossil, and this is an interesting fossil that's been placed kind of close to AV Metatarsiale. Unfortunately, we don't have a really good image of the ankle of this creature, but so we kind of think that it might be over here, but it might end up being on the other side of the Curatarsia. So I included it here because it's a really amazing specimen. This is Scleromuculus, and Scleromuculus is this really weird creature with really long legs. Fairly small. The scale bar there on the diagram is about 1 centimeter. So yay big. Had a very low, wide skull, really long hind legs. We don't really have a good picture of the tarsal joint, the ankle joint, so it could be a crocodile reverse or it could be a Curatarsian. We'll just kind of have to see if we can get some more specimens. It's known from the Triassic of Scotland. So it may be a basal ornithoderen, it may be a very gracile Curatarsian. Don't know exactly where it's positioned, but it's a really, really bizarre and interesting critter, and it's difficult for us to place it exactly on the cladogram. So right now it's kind of positioned as a group right outside the AV Metatarsiale. It might be closely related to pterosaurs and to dinosaurs. If we look at some of the extinct Curatarsi, one of the major groups that's well represented in the fossil record is the Phytosaurs, Phytosauria. These have very long snouts, and they resemble crocodilians. In fact, we find lots of these Phytosaurs in the Triassic here in Utah, as well as in New Mexico and Arizona. They're very common. They differ in that the nose opening, the nares, is actually not found on the tip of the nose. It's actually up on top of the head. So you'll see that the nares is right up here, and this meant that they could basically, when they were swimming around like a crocodile, they could just have that tip of the nose sticking out, as well as their eyes, which are positioned right up here. So the nose, the eyes just sticking out of the water, and then kept the rest of their bodies underwater, and they could go around and jump up and snap off and attack prey. So Phytosaurs, really kind of a neat fossil, very common. In fact, we find Phytosaur trackways here in Utah, and there's a number of really neat skulls, mostly found in southern Utah, as well as New Mexico, and of course Arizona, which has a lot of these Phytosaurs. They're found often in the Chinle Formation. Of the Curatarsian, there's another group called the Rauisuchians. The Rauisuchians are a very diverse group of Curatarsians, and they include a whole host of families. And what's really fascinating, I think, about the Rauisuchians is that they look like dinosaurs. If you looked at a picture of one of these or found one of these, you'd think you had found a dinosaur. But if you got to the ankle, you'd notice that it had a Curatarsian ankle joint, and so they're actually more closely related to alligators and crocodiles than they are to dinosaurs. Now they include a number of different families, and we'll go through each one of these. So these are not dinosaurs, these are Rauisuchians, but they do look like dinosaurs. So this is Ornithosuchidae, which is a fascinating group. They have a slightly open acetabulum, which is kind of a convergent trait that we see in dinosaurs. In fact, the trait that unites all dinosaurs is an open acetabulum in the hip socket of the pelvis. They have a large diastema, that is a gap in the teeth between the premaxilla and the maxilla that you can see kind of in this diagram is labeled D. So a diastema there. They have a long snout, And this family is usually probably a basal Rauisuchian. So they have the ankle joint of a crocodile. They have kind of this open acetabulum of a dinosaur. They kind of look like a dinosaur, and they're actually really big. That's a meter, so they're big animals. They're roaming around during the Triassic. Next group is sort of three different families: the Rauisuchians, the Pleistocene, and the Papasauridae. These all have large metalateral compressed craniums, so they're kind of like squished. They have a very erect gait as a result of ventrally directed acetabulum. So one of the things that they do with the hip joint is that the acetabulum is kind of open, and oftentimes will have a curve that curves down like this, and this allows the femur to be positioned underneath the pelvis, and so this means they have a much more upright stance. Some species may have been actually bipedal, and so these guys were also the top predators during the Triassic and very diverse. The interesting is that Papasauridae lack osteoderms, but many of the other groups do have osteoderms, bony scutes under the skin. Chattardia is an interesting and very enigmatic group of Rauisuchians. This is the only group that we've talked about that lacks teeth. They have like this bill-like thing on the front, so they kind of look like a bird skull. They're edentulous. They have a very large eye, it's a large orbit, and some of these were obligate bipedals. That meant that they were running around all the time on two legs, kind of like humans. So running around on two legs. So very interesting group, the Chattardia, although that they are these Curatarsians. So this is a beautiful skeleton of a Chattardian, and you can see that it has the crocodile normal joint in the ankle, yet it has this dinosaur. I mean, this looks like a dinosaur. And here we don't have any teeth, big eyes, bipedal, running around, but is not a dinosaur. It's a Rauisuchian, one of these Curatarsian groups. Really interesting group. The next group is the Teniasauridae, which is a group of derived Rauisuchians. These were very large. That's a half a meter on that scale there. So these were pretty large creatures, carnivorous. They had this dorsal spine where the neural spines form a sail-like structure off the vertebral column. You see this? They're really kind of a bizarre group. They've lost their osteoderms, so they lack these bony scutes. And this is believed to be a synapomorphy, a shared trait that we see with the Papasauridae. And very interesting group, oftentimes mistaken as dinosaurs when they're found, but once you find a bit more of them, you realize that they're actually these Rauisuchians living in the Triassic, hunting down, being one of the top carnivores. One of the weirdest groups of these Archosauromorphs is the Atelosauridae, or the Stagnoleptidae. This is two families of really interesting group of archosaurs that in many ways resemble armadillos. They have these very kind of interesting complex heads that are sort of expanded out and have a long snout. They also have peg-like teeth and are probably herbivores rather than carnivores. They have tons of osteoderms and are completely armored, and some of these have big huge spikes, and I'll show a picture of that in a second. They have fairly small heads compared to the bodies, and they have this interesting kind of snout that probably was covered with a keratin sheath, probably had really good smell, and probably were digging around a lot. In fact, they have an expanded olecranon process on the ulna, which is the elbow, and this probably gave them a great ability to dig and burrow into the dirt. They were fairly large size, like crocodile size, so they got fairly big. You find their bony scutes in many, many places in the Triassic of North America, for example, in Texas, Arizona, even here in Utah. So the Teniasauridae, wonderful group. Here you can see some of those spikes. These big spikes are coming off the shoulders, big, huge osteoderms. So really interesting. You can actually identify some of the groups based on the osteoderms. It's really rare to find a beautiful skeleton like this that shows how the osteoderms covered the body, but they were definitely covered with all these osteoderms that provide some protection from some of these big Rauisuchian predators that they had to deal with. So really interesting group in the Triassic. Not related to dinosaurs, but very dinosaur-like, aren't they? So the next group is the Uintah, and now let's talk a little bit about crocodilomorph origin. So this is the genus that's oftentimes associated with the ancestor of crocodiles and alligators later on, which don't really come onto the scene until we get into the Cenozoic as true genera, but they become quite diverse during the Mesozoic, and we have quite a bit of diversity early on. So this is probably the group that started going off into that lineage that's going to eventually become the crocodilians. They have round teeth that are lacking crania. They have an otic recess formed by an anterior sloping quadrate and quadrijugal. In fact, this is a kind of an important feature. We'll talk about it. It has a kind of a notch back here in the back of the skull that you can see here. These guys have a reduced tooth row. In fact, they have just kind of teeth out in the front here. So they kind of lost a lot of teeth. So they have kind of an interesting teeth. You can just see them being out here in the very anterior part of the maxilla and the premaxilla here. Now that trait, the otic recess back there, is actually something we see in modern alligators and crocodiles. And you see that otic recess back in here, and you see that in here next to the quadrijugal. Here's a quadrijugal coming across here, and this is quadrate. Moving around here, this is the squamosal bone. So you see that kind of configuration, which indicates that these guys are pretty closely related to crocodiles and alligators. Cretaceous diversity in the Triassic. So we have many distinct morphologies, morphotypes. The Phytosaurs filled the aquatic niche, probably as ambush predators similar to modern crocodiles and gavids. We have the Stagolopodoids, were these heavy armored generalists. Many taxa may have been carnivorous, others may have exploited colonial insects and plants, and many Rauisuchian show the striking convergence to derive dinosaurian taxa. In fact, many of them look like dinosaurs, but they're not. So very interesting group, the Cretaceans. These are all the ones with the crocodile normal ankle joint. All right, thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Archosauromorphs.